Great. Um, just to start with a tiny anecdote, because I've been at a slasher summer camp this morning. Apparently, one of the main actresses in Friday the 13th, number 6, is actually called Jennifer Cooke, which we found out today, which was kind of fun. But anyway, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening and for joining me today on a talk about video games. Thank you again to Sam, and thank you to Romancing the Gothic for all the work that you do with both the project and with yourself. I think it's amazing. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name's Jenny. I am a PhD researcher at Newcastle University, working on horror gaming and online consumption, amongst other things. So today I'm going to be talking to you all about some of the ways that horror video games can work to align themselves with your bodies, and also what that could mean for memory, and specifically folklore in gaming as a memory relic or a memory artifact. For today, I'll be using 2 games to illustrate what I'm talking about, but they can be applied to any game that utilizes folklore or history from a culture's background. For today, I'll be talking about Bramble, the Mountain King, and Unforgiving, a Northern Hymn, which I'll go through more later, but those are the 2 in case you want to Google them as we go along. By folklore, I'm referring to the cultural stories passed between groups. Some of these stories might fall into the mythology camp, but a lot of them will fall under folklore. To do that, I'm going to have to walk you through some cognitive science. I'm sorry. I'll promise I'll keep it gentle because I'm humanities. I'm not a scientist by trade. I see a cat. This is amazing. And then we can move on to the games. But to start, I want to think about Gothic, horror, and folklore just a little bit. Since horror and Gothic studies and media and game studies have somewhat of a contentious relationship with one another, so I'm getting the imposter syndrome out of the way before we start properly. So I'm sure a lot of you recognize this book cover or this title, It Was a Dark and Stormy Night. Some people like to think of Gothic and horror as synonymous in some way. And it's true that a lot of the stylistic elements of Gothic are present in horror and vice versa, if I'm allowed to say that without being shot by Gothic scholars. But with the slightly diffused definition between the 2, we can take notice of some of the elements of Gothic in these games that are marketed and recognized by players as horror. Certainly, they hold space for the fairy tales and folklore from respective heritages in both kind of manners. I have included on screen a smorgasbord of dictionary definitions of the Gothic pertaining to the type that we think when we hear the word in our circles. And you'll notice that none of them fall under the primary definition, which is a little bit unhelpful, especially with the OED throwing it under additional sense rather than any of the 1, 2, 3, which I think was a bit brutal, but oh well. Personally, I enjoy the barbarous, rude, and uncouth definition, specifically in relation to horror, because the bad taste is a lot of what horror scholars tend to be accused of anyway, which, I mean, we were just talking about Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey 2 is one of my best films of this year, so maybe it counts, who knows. So Reyes has said that body horror is one of the loosest and ill-defined elements of Gothic literary fiction, and genre, especially horror, already takes an issue with being defined. Luckily for us today, we're going to be thinking about the body in horror as opposed to body horror. So the body itself is going to be spoken about in connection with the body in the games and how the 2 interact with one another. And with horror, as with the Gothic, the monstrous other will be existing in the margins. In the case of these games, in hidden fantastical forests that the characters find themselves in, some of them not even technically existing on this plane. So the destabilization that occurs in these games is because of how they respond to one another. I'll speak about it later, but the character you control has to enact what you're telling them to do through the controls. But at the same time, you have to use those same controls yourself to protect them as your liaison, your avatar in the world, and at times an extension of yourself as well. Edmondson has written that the horror film, in effect, gathers up the anxiety that is free-floating in the reader or viewer and binds it to the narrative. The anxiety is displaced and brought under temporary, tenuous control. In the case of games, in particular, the player is bound up with the narrative in a reciprocal relationship back and forth, where they are also co-creating the narrative through their decisions and their own personal skills. This is, of course, as much as is possible in a pre-written narrative, where things are literally coded in the space to be interacted with. You can only open a drawer if someone has coded that drawer to be openable. Which I will come back to, but for now, I regret to inform you that I have to frame some of this with science now. So here we go. One of the first things to note is that horror gaming, much like most horror media, at least audiovisual media, uses jump scares. which we can liken, if not replace, in cognitive sciences with the idea of the startle reflex, or in cultural studies with the idea of the startle affect. This is when a spike in stimulus or experiences makes you jump. It's always accompanied by a blink and sometimes with a surge of adrenaline. It's horror's bread and butter. For the sake of this talk, I'll be using jump scare and startle synonymously. They aren't entirely, not at all, but the specifics won't come into play too much today, apart from with one aspect, which I will mention. So there's been some evidence that there are two distinct pathways that the startle can take. One is quicker and doesn't go through the brain. It goes straight from the ear to the eye and then you blink. The second is the one we care about today. It's called the affect modulated startle, and it's usually the one that you would experience when you are watching a horror film or playing a horror game. The affect that modulates it tends to just be whatever is causing the jump scare in the first place. It becomes something like what gets called the fear potentiated startle if the thing that's causing it is something fearful or scary or horrifying. So a lot of this work tends to come out of PTSD studies in particular. We can still apply the bodily responses to how players encounter media because of how immersive they can become. And even if they feel it to a lesser extent than with real life trauma, which is really important, the responses that the body undergoes to keep itself safe will follow similar patterns. Some really incredible work is being done by other scholars about horror's capacity within therapeutic spaces. Shout out to Amy, who was here this morning, particularly who first made me aware of all of this. So the startle and memory, it occurs in the body because it's being carried out using dopamine. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but suffice to say, there are links in the body between the networks that carry out the startle and those associated with memory. Both of them use dopamine. Dopamine is sometimes thought of as the happiness chemical, the happy fun time chemical, but it does so much more than that. Likewise, aversive learning, or learning under threat, or learning through threat, is established quicker and stronger than any other condition. So midbrain dopamine has seen research to support its role in aversive memory formation, so threatening memory formation. The affect modulated startle takes a pathway right through the brain, the same space in the brain, especially in fear potentiated startles, and it's transmitted using that same dopamine. Not the same dopamine, but the same neurochemical. It's all extrapolation, of course, but it has interesting applications if we think about how to weaponize genre for the sake of cultural or collective memory. So memory could then be associated with aversive threatening conditions. Neurobiologists really dislike saying that there's one unconnected neural process for these things, A to B, but the networks between fear and memory are entwined enough to suggest that fear potentiated learning could be really strong. So what we're looking for in horror games then is anything that increases the intensity or quantity of the jump scares that startle, so that the associated memory also comes through. And we're looking for the threats to feel real. This is where the bodily coupling comes in, and this is also where the gameplay comes in. Luckily for us, gaming is one of the most, if not the most, interactive and embodied forms of fictional media that we can encounter. Unfortunately for us, there are a lot of things that can affect the intensity or frequency of the startle. Here are just some of them. Jump scare. For today, let's just consider a few. In terms of what a horror gaming can affect from its own production, we can think about balance and we can think about attention and arousal. A game can't exactly affect your own caffeine intake, so we're not going to think about that. But as a quick side note, just so you can take something away from this talk, if not anything I'm saying, if you're a coward and scared of horror like I am, I will point out a few that are controllable from your end, so you can at least take away some coping mechanisms for scary media. So increasing caffeine will increase your propensity to startle. Same with alcohol. More alcohol, you are likely to startle less, which I'm sure some of you might have noticed with horror. In terms of biological sex, I will say that most of the research that's been done there has been done on rats, so I can't talk to it in any huge way, but also the noise. If you have a lot of noise, the more you raise a sound, the more likely you are to jump. Some of these are really straightforward, but things like training and rock climbing is less so. So that's fun. Okay, moving on then. When we talk about arousal, I'm not talking about that kind. It's the baseline before you hit a threshold for a jump scare happening. If the same jump scare happens too often, you'll just stop responding to it. So novelty is also really important. You can't have the same type of jump scare each time, or it begins to feel cheap and the emotional payoff wouldn't come through either. So emotional valence then, so valence of a stimulus, describes the extent to which an emotion is positive or negative, whereas arousal then refers to its intensity, how strongly you feel that emotion. Valence is just whether you view something as good or bad. So the negative valence is all over horror because it's always coded something in the area that needs to be avoided, something like gore or dread or spooky faces or a spooky doll or spooky insert item. It lowers the threshold for the jump scare. So horror games need to keep the environment scary whilst not making the players bored. There needs to be a level of attention and arousal that comes from novelty. So although there is a part of your brain that absolutely knows that a story is fictional and eases your responses to it, there is no evolutionary process for surprise but fictional, or anger but in response to a story. You respond to it as real first, and then your brain fills out the rest of the response with the context, so you don't do something like punch a television. Not that that stops some football fans, but oh well. So I'll come back to it later in the talk when I talk more on game mechanisms, but the more immersed a player gets into a game, the more coupled their body is with the avatar, the playable character, and the more distorted their own bodily boundaries become. This is when the reality processing, which is the process by which we decide how strongly to respond, could be dampened. Okay, so that is us slightly done with the science, but I want you to hold on to those thoughts because we're going to see how they play out in a game or two. Both of the games I'm going to talk about use folklore and specifically horror elements. Unforgiving a Northern Hymn on the left was created by Angry Demon Studio. Our out-and-out horror game, it is very self-referential as a horror game, and the developers used their own interpretations of the folktales the developers had encountered as children. Bramble the Mountain King on the right was created by Dimfrost Studio as more of a dark adventure game. Both draw on elements of horror, though, to increase the idea of player engagement. Horror and folklore have long gone hand in hand. Children used to be told about evil witches and big bad wolves to stop them from talking to strangers or going into the woods at night by themselves. So the didacticism or the teaching capabilities of folklore has always been part of storytelling and horror from the earliest functions of oral history. And it also makes up a huge part of the collective cultural memory in which communities can locate themselves. These two are European games as examples, but the ideas could work for other cultures too, if they use horror as well. So to start, it would be interesting to see how the developers themselves use their space to describe the games, which helped us to see how they intended the games to be seen because genre is so often malleable. These have been lifted from the Steam page, which is where they advertise themselves. Northern Hymn says that not only are the old stories true, but the things that crawl in the shadows are more wretched than you could have ever imagined. The whispers of the northern woods pick at your sanity, your fingers tremble as you light your final match, body shivering from dread, do you sense them hunting you? There's more there, but in general, we can see that they're actively trying to cultivate a sense of fear surrounding their game. In Unforgiving a Northern Hymn, you play as Lynn, who is trying to reconnect with her brother after they get split up in a forest. And as you'll notice on the bottom right-hand side, one of the popular user-defined tags for the product is horror. Bramble the Mountain King takes a less specifically horror-centric approach, but as you'll see with both of them, they are aimed at the second-person perspective, speaking directly to the player. So Bramble the Mountain King says, Bramble the Mountain King takes you on a gripping and unsettling journey through stunning landscapes. Take on the role of Ole, a young boy setting off to rescue his sister kidnapped by the dreaded troll. To clarify, this one is the less immediately horror genre game. So if you are, again, a little bit of a coward like me, feel free to play it and enjoy whimsical terror of Ole trying to navigate the horror fantasy setting. Both are about family, about being lost and encountering folklore in the woods whilst trying to reunite with a lost loved one. Regardless, both of these games take the mutual need to explore a fantastical and often terrifying space that is populated by creatures from their respective folklore. Unforgiving a Northern Hymn even markets itself on its page as a first-person horror game inspired by Swedish folklore and Nordic mythology. Bramble doesn't immediately say itself that it's a horror game, it just goes with dark adventure. But as you'll notice, the users consider it to be a horror. They're using the myths to create the nightmares that have been haunting children for many generations. So horror gaming, in this case, working with folkloric adaptation, takes an overt step away from the safe or sanitized childhood versions of stories and is solely playable by those above a certain age rating, creating a space in which players feel a certain ownership and community before the game itself even starts. It also creates an interactive landscape in which engaging with cultural touchstones is presented in an adult manner, with details that they may then remember. It is a space for young adults and adults more broadly to interact with their own folklore and heritage. In a slide or two, we'll see some monsters. And I want you to keep in mind that these look horrifyingly different to the illustrated stories in fairy tales. I went into the archives the other day and had all the illustrated pages of these fairy tales, and some of them were like Gothic adjacent, but none of them were overtly horrifying. And so it provides an alternative perspective, one that makes adults feel as though they are in confidence, keeping the secret of alternative versions of their folklores and including them in a space that's especially for them. So spatial exploration being handed over to the player is really important. Their own culpability within the environment is imperative and necessary to them, engaging with folklore on their own terms, instead of more passively listening to it or reading a constructed version of it. Of course, that's not to say that the exposition documents aren't written by the developers, but the horror aesthetic diversifies the creatures so they're not as static. A player can remember the creature in relation to their own mediated encounter with it. You might see on the next couple of slides that there's a Skogskra, and although they are somewhat different between the two games, they have some similarities, but they will be different from the books. So the core entanglement of the player to their avatar creates a stronger entwinement to the narrative. Kabir has said that affect worlds are epidermal and haptic. We want to be able to touch the games and have them touch us too. So then how do they touch us? So what's interesting about the startle in relation to this touching is that it's inherently deeply ingrained into the gaming. So uncertainty, which is the build up to a startle when you don't know when it's going to happen, within a negative or threatening situation, actually lowers that arousal threshold I was talking about earlier, which is why you're so much more likely to jump during a horror versus during a comedy. Your body is waiting to respond to a perceived threat when the surrounding situation is negative, especially in gaming, when you're so aligned with the agency and responsiveness of the player character, here being Ole on the left. This is because your immediate reaction and response to danger is their response as well within a fearful scenario. It brings you back to your own body when you jump as well. Horror scholars generally agree that the genre is one obsessed with the body, with having bodily response thrust upon you, often aligned with masochistic or sadistic desires to feel something that is taken out of your hands. I can talk more about the lived body later, but for now, just the idea of the startle bringing you back into your own lived body rather than that moment of entanglement. But the unintentional bodily response comes with reflexes, where responses happen before you think about them. And video games weaponize this by requiring your reflexes as part of the gameplay. In Bramble the Mountain King, certain areas involve timing. The reflexes of the player are coupled with the reflexes of their on-screen double, in this case, the small boy named Ole. It's more important to respond quickly to a perceived threat than it is to not respond to an actual threat. So our bodies create space where a fast response at a lower level is the main priority. When Ole encounters something scary, something terrifying, both he and you need to respond quickly in order to survive, blurring your own particular bodily boundaries. And so Plutchik has said that the startle reflects microsecond failings to anticipate the identity, location, or status of a stimulus in a threatening context. And in these games, the mechanics work to exacerbate this. So when Ole is attempting to respond quickly to, say, the butcher troll, who you'll see in a couple of slides, and run around all the meat and viscera, you as the player also need to be responding to the fast-paced cues and mirror or even align your reaction time with his, drawing your bodies close together. And this is where things like muscle memory come in, which I'll discuss later in terms of point of view, since this game in particular does mess with it a bit. So I posted about this on Twitter, but I might have given my computer viruses with this video. But here is a short video collated by G.V on YouTube, showcasing the different aesthetic portrayals of each of the monsters in Bramble the Mountain King. For later, please pay attention to the differences in how all the monsters are presented and how, and as with the other video too, we're going to have to stop for a second. Thanks. Okay, great. So in relation to anticipating threats, Though we have the searching in our more overt horror game and also in Bramble to a lesser extent, which increases the capability of a player to mitigate or reduce that sense of uncertainty through finding knowledge. So in games, exploration is built to be a key aspect of the gameplay, specifically in these two. Players must go between buildings to find notes, journals, and puzzles in order to progress, often in the dark where they cannot detect the location of a threat. So it also then builds up that uncertainty again. On screen, you'll see information about the Naken in both games, a creature, and you will find these pages with this information by exploration. This is just one of the pages about them, but in Unforgiving and Northern Hymn, the player must walk a path throughout the digital landscape. Part of this is a dark forest with some swamps and small villages. You have to discover details of the folklore through interaction, specifically with the space. Bramble the Mountain King does a similar trend of discovering folklore through exploration and space, but the forest is slightly friendlier. Not to Ole, he's about this big and he keeps falling on spikes, but that's his own thing. So you find exposition by opening drawers, reading signs, and exploring abandoned buildings. And an important aspect of this is that the game does not differentiate in the exploration phases between useful and useless exposition, meaning that a player must actively search the space and linger in a horror-inducing area. And the folklore that they encounter in pages throughout the gameplay becomes real in the sense that the clues offered will operate within the space as true. And the player must treat them that way. They must remember the writing on any of the creatures that they find, as it becomes part of the rules for survival. And it's a necessity because they will encounter these creatures that are being referenced during the game. The monsters become actual threats within the space to the character and then by extension to the player. The player must pay attention to any information about them, as it is usually involving clues about their weaknesses alongside their stories as well. This is especially true as the games play with more than one folkloric monster. In Unforgiving and Northern Hymn, the player must remember all the details to remember which aspect of response is appropriate and will help them in their attempts for survival. So this is the second of the two videos. And this shows some of the gameplay in Unforgiving. It shows how exposition is found and how interaction with space and light is imperative to discovering your surroundings. And I'm not thanking my father here, that is just the account name, I promise. And yeah, I'm gonna wait for the stop. Okay. So one of the things I'll quickly mention is that there is also a bit of a resource panic in that game because matches do get used up, and part of the same exploration is to cultivate resources and get the matches as you go. But then we've also got uncertainty about which monster will be turning up, which heightens effective responses, keeps that novelty, keeps you from being bored. And we've got negative and threatening valence from the monsters, which look really scary in the games. So we're doing all the things that need to make our startle increase. Great. In Unforgiving, attempting to hide from a troll would be useful because they have low light vision. They have poor low light vision. But the same tactic would get the player killed if they try to use it on a Skogsra. And the tree spirits Skogsra are adapted from childhood stories heard by the game developers. They are embedded in these stories, and their own personalized experiences of their folklore are drawn upon during the creation and development of their aesthetics. And the naming is also really interesting to me. Sometimes the same spirits get called Huldra or Huld in Norwegian fairy tales or English translations of fairy tales of Scandinavia. So what's interesting then is the prevalence of the use of Hulda in English translation and the game's refusal, both games in fact, refuse to use that framing. So in keeping them specifically tied to their own heritage, even in a globally translated game, it really pushes for that specific experience rather than one that is either sanitized for children or marketed to a generalized or broad audience. I mentioned earlier about how folklore is often aimed at children, and that can be tricky because horror as a genre is definitely not aimed at children in these kind of environments. Although I know a few scholars who would definitely disagree with me. I'm not saying that children never encounter horror, just this kind of horror. And ones with age ratings as well, which means that the folklore can be rediscovered by people who might not otherwise even think about it until they have children of their own. It allows them an autonomous space to interact with the stories. Even the two games show Skogsra aesthetically differently, with some similarities to their core, the open back room specifically, but it denies them a passive representation. Even more so, as instead of being on the page as passive, or static beings, these creatures have agency to actively hunt the player. So the player is being forced into a prey position. The player must operate then as sentinel or guard to their avatar, protecting where possible to avoid game death. The survival mechanics of the game, being so inherently baked into the concepts of their folklores, creates a space in which memory would thrive, as it is being treated as true. Within the story, the fiction is being treated as real, and the startle response triggered by the creature's appearances acts to treat them as an actual threat during the playtime, which then might cultivate memory. So moving away from exposition a little bit, we can think about agency. And agency is distributed a little bit in games. Avatars act as the liaison between the player and the story. Ole here. You encounter the story through your playable character. That agency comes from the player's ability to enact change in the world and the avatar's ability to allow the player access to the story. These games also have agency. For horror games, that agency is usually to just kill you. So the idea of control is referred to as agency. It's a sense of interactivity, autonomy, and presence that a player is said to feel as they make choices in the game's virtual world. So Rigby and Ryan explained that agency allows players to be engaged and make stories their own. Perron then theorizes that agency refers to perceived causality between one's actions and events in the virtual environment. Perron's version sometimes also gets referred to as self-efficacy in certain circles. So in relation to the title and the bodies might reach out in two different directions, with the player and character blurring, as they hold a multi-directional interdependent body between themselves during the playtime, during the gameplay, that of the character and that of the player. The coupled bodies of the players must take responsibility for their responses and actions on screen that are directly related to their own physical capabilities, things like reaction time, reflexes, and the appropriate responses to certain monsters. So the coupling of the bodies occurs at the level of self-efficacy or agency. The player's response is inherently linked to the avatars in terms of cause and effect, which causes a blur between their respective boundaries to get a little bit more post-human. So the bodies of the characters are something that we can access from the point of view that the game allows to us. You'll see here, this will be a third person. So what's interesting is that both of these games, from a mechanics perspective, use different points of view. So the difference between seeing the character's perspective versus seeing the whole body from a distance. Smith has a paradigm for empathetic engagement in games, which is problematized in first person like this in Unforgiving. He thinks the player doesn't have access to the thing that would typically allow for effective mimicry and emotional contagion, which is the body and face of the protagonist. He speaks of other means of engaging in that effective mimicry, which is to do with the alignment of bodies and responses, which I spoke about earlier. In Unforgiving, you often see forearms, as in this picture, and have the same point of view as you might have in front of your PC with the forearms in front of you. Maybe not quite, you're not trying to pull your brother from under a tree in real life, but you are trying to do it with the keys available to you. It's a bit of a tangent I'm about to go on, but I promise it's relevant. Fairly recently, they found out that Mackie monkeys have something in their brain that will see a hand from a first-person point perspective as their own. And we have something similar in our brains as well. So the thing that's similar in our brains is built to understand action potential through firing the neurons that are responsible for action itself when you see something happening on screen. This isn't to say you automatically empathize. That's a kind of worms we can't get into right now. But in terms of feeling or cognitively experiencing and being aware of what your character is going through, unless as if you are also undergoing the actions, there is support to suggest that that might be the case. If you see someone getting stabbed, your brain will try and contextualize it by the feelings of pain in the past. So this is reversed. No, that's wrong. I was on the wrong bit. So likewise, there's been some research to suggest that brains might sometimes align actions committed by others' arms as your own, like I mentioned. So this would then be reversed in third-person games where you don't see the same point of view as your own, like with Ollie and Bramble throughout the gameplay. A lot of the times you cannot align your body with his in the same manner that you could in a first-person game. So third-person games can also create a bit of unease, even in non-horror games, even with Unreal Engine allowing for some pretty sophisticated levels of 3D modeling. The faces will never look completely natural. Ole is objectively adorable, but he definitely does not look human. Nevertheless, Ramho, my one Gothic quote for today, spoke of the senses being coupled in Gothic fiction in a way that I think works quite nicely here. It's a matter of contamination, of the self being infected by the other via sensory contact, the other here being our character. So whichever way a game chooses to show a view of the world, there is always a potential for emotional contagion and a coupling of bodies, even though there are pros and cons in either case. But even more than the point of view, because this is a games talk, we've got to talk about the buttons. So it is the accompanied buttons associated with gameplay. They come into play when we think about muscle memory or perception action coupling, which is an awareness of the body and the movements it is capable of without thinking about every individual movement you take to get there. It's a difference between thinking about every hand and arm and muscle movement it would take to pick up a cup versus doing it more naturally. So perception action coupling is thought of as the coordination between vision and movement, particularly of the hands and feet, the link between what we see and what we do. In game media, this looks like using the same button for a certain action and getting to a point of comfort and familiarity with the game, where the player will unconsciously associate the button and movement of the hand motion with the action itself. This is doubly true of games that allow for readjusting key bindings to preferred keys, and it relies on a stable mechanic. It's the feeling in first-person games of W always meaning forwards. Eventually, you would automatically try to use that button to mean a forward momentum, even in new games. If that key suddenly changed, God forbid, your play experience would be slightly destabilized and potentially less immersive, more actively considering each action. In third-person games, this can change unless the camera is fixed. W would not always mean forwards. This is for PC gaming in particular, which was true of the older games that used to attach movement to player character instead of camera, things like Silent Hill, which used something called tank controls. Luckily, with horror gaming, sometimes this destabilization is not the end of the world. It can also help keep players actively involved in the game rather than mindlessly moving. It makes them consider their movements more thoroughly, which can help with that uncertainty. The mechanics other than movement, which have to do with survival, also remain static throughout, the same. For Bramble, these are sprinting, crouching, and using the light, which are all directly related to survival. This is important, as these are the ones that the player uses to feel coupled in moments of high fear. The survival mechanics and keys will be used after something like a jump scare or when a terrifying creature appears. And so specifically, coupling these actions with these moments encourages a bodily memory with the game in moments of high fear when these creatures are present. So the integration of the player and character's perceptive fields and their twin movements of the body is something which would only serve to heighten immersion. Because in a game where movement and perception being coupled is the difference between game, life, or death, we can reasonably suggest that immersion is likewise coupled. If no one wants to look at that creepy looking face up top, there is a little ghost gif you can look at instead. This would be the case in Unforgiving: A Northern Hymn, in which you are aligned with Lynn all the way through the game. And her abilities to move, hear, and see are synonymous with your own. All the capabilities in the game are tied to her for you. Contrastingly, in third person, in Bramble the Mountain King, might typically serve to lessen the sense of coupling. In a horror game, it does the game the benefit of continuously changing the threat direction and detection abilities for you. It makes the player constantly on the lookout for threats, rather than an extension of seemingly their own perception. It forces them into a guard position towards their character. If you were aligned with Ollie in this moment, you wouldn't know anything was behind you, but we know that there is. And so we have this weird dual sensation of trying to support him while also working against it. So this would be scanning and paying attention, and by extension, plunging yourself deeper into the game to couple your perception with the available danger cues instead of the character's capabilities. If you'll forgive me some etymology, immersion comes from the Latin to plunge or sink into. The player has to sink into the game and attempt to search for threats whilst being denied access to the avatar's direct point of view. And in terms of sinking into the game, the coupling either occurs with the game camera and therefore the game mechanics, as in Bramble, or with the character itself in something like Unforgiving. And both are destabilizing enough that the horror would act to make the folklore memorable. I'm not trying to say that one particular point of view is better or more effective than another. Both can use their own mechanisms to create tension, uncertainty, and unease for that all too important jump scare. And really importantly in both of these games in relation to memory and to keeping collective memory alive is that the folklore is so important for survival. Players must take the folklore seriously during the gameplay. To not treat the folklore as true within the space of the game you give up the one advantage you have in the space, which is knowing your enemy. Okay, this is the last little bit for me. Time is inherently quite important in these games, with cycles moving between the characters and the folklore, stories that are structurally cyclical as they are told and retold. Time for the player is important too if you consider the link to reflexes. The need for immediate response of the player to threats keeps them immersed in the digital space, in which they are performing a narrative loop for the avatar, a game that can always be replayed in another memory slot, which I love that it gets called memory slots. In both games, there's a slightly more open world style, more so definitely in Unforgiving, and it encourages a sense of play. The spaces are imbued with clues on how to survive and then are inhabited by those creatures which the information discusses, immediately making them real. In Unforgiving specifically, the story itself is replayed like a game. I'm about to do a huge spoiler, so if you do want to play this game, cover your ears and I'll wave when I'm done. The protagonist forgets each time that the narrative is completed, waking up amnesiac at the start of the game alongside the player. She's actually in purgatory. It makes the game something like a cultural cyber memory artifact, the relic I mentioned at the start. Enacted at the start of the game at the point of play, the avatar learns with the player each time the game starts. Okay, just end of spoiler. Adding to this is the AI used throughout Unforgiving, which creates different forest paths within the same world at the start of each new game. In the same way that children hear different oral versions of stories, depending on which verbal paths someone takes them on. And this gets repeated. On screen, you'll see that Mitchell says, since the operation of writing of information in memory is fundamental to digital computation, the logic of replication quickly manifested itself in early computers. Programmers learned to code loops that would write the same information repeatedly into memory. And cyberspace is a key aspect of games, with the games operating as a digital memoryscape. The idea of programmers coding loops in their work to create memory is really interesting there. And the repetition of interactions that the player goes through is important to the story and to the memory of the story specifically. So the game can repeat, the folklore repeats, and the players can then also repeat, each in a manner that creates and retains traces of cultural, communal memory for a new group of players. Horror could act as a link between memory artifact and memory cultivation within those consumers. That is me done. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.